Michelle Obama accesses classified White House records. What she learns about the Reagan years shocks the world. The autumn wind whistled through the narrow streets of Washington, D.C., sending fallen leaves dancing across the pavement. Michelle Obama pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as she climbed the imposing steps of the National Archives building. Despite having visited countless times during her years as First Lady, something felt different today. "Mrs. Obama, welcome back," said James Mitchell, the head archivist, greeting her with a warm smile. His gray hair was messier than usual, and dark circles under his eyes suggested long nights of work. "We've prepared the Reagan files as requested." "Thank you, James. How long did it take to declassify all this?" Michelle asked, following him through the marble corridors. "Months. Some of these documents haven't seen daylight in 40 years. He paused, glancing over his shoulder. "Are you sure you want to do this alone? The amount of material is overwhelming." Michelle smiled, thinking of Barack's reaction when she'd told him about this project. "Actually, I won't be alone. My research assistant should be here Mrs. Obama." A young woman's voice echoed through the hallway. Sarah Chen, fresh out of Harvard's history department, hurried toward them, her arms full of notebooks and laptops. "I'm so sorry I'm late. The traffic was horrible, and then security had to triple-check my credentials." "Don't worry, Sarah. We haven't started yet." Michelle turned to James. "Sarah will be helping me organize everything. She's brilliant with data analysis." James nodded, leading them deeper into the building. The corridors grew narrower, the lighting dimmer. Finally, they reached a heavy wooden door marked "Special Collections, Authorized Personnel Only." "This will be your workspace," James said, unlocking the door. "I've had everything brought up from deep storage. The boxes are organized chronologically, starting with 1981. Michelle stepped into the room and caught her breath. The space was larger than she'd expected, with a massive oak table in the center. But what drew her attention were the walls, lined with rows of boxes, folders, and document cases. "There must be thousands of pages here," Sarah whispered, setting down her things. James cleared his throat. "Mrs. Obama, before I leave you to it, there's something you should know." He hesitated, fidgeting with his keyring. "Some of these documents, well, they weren't supposed to be declassified for another decade. But given your status as a former First Lady and your research credentials..." Michelle raised an eyebrow. "What are you trying to say, James?" He lowered his voice. "Just be prepared. The Reagan years weren't as simple as the history books make them out to be." After James left, Michelle and Sarah spent the first hour simply organizing their workspace. Sarah set up her laptop and recording equipment, while Michelle arranged the first set of boxes within easy reach. "Where should we start?" Sarah asked, pulling out her color-coded sticky notes. Michelle ran her fingers along the edge of a box marked 1981, Personal Correspondence. "Let's begin at the beginning, the transition period, when the Reagans first moved in." The morning passed quietly as they sorted through mundane documents, scheduling notes, visitor logs, menu plans for state dinners. Sarah maintained a detailed digital catalog, occasionally asking questions about White House protocols. "Mrs. Obama," Sarah said around noon, looking up from a stack of papers, "can I ask why you chose this particular project? Of all the presidential records you could access." Michelle leaned back in her chair, considering the question. "You know, when I first became First Lady, Nancy Reagan was incredibly kind to me. She called several times during the transition, offering advice, warnings about what to expect." She paused, remembering those conversations. But there was always something in her voice. A sadness, maybe. Like she was carrying something heavy. "And you think these records might explain what that was?" "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just being sentimental." Michelle smiled. "Let's break for lunch. We can't think straight on empty stomachs." They ordered sandwiches from a nearby deli, eating as they worked. The afternoon brought more interesting findings: memos about early policy initiatives, notes from cabinet meetings, draft speeches covered in handwritten edits. "Look at this," Sarah said, holding up a yellowed page. Nancy's notes about the assassination attempt. She was terrified he wouldn't survive. Michelle took the paper carefully. Nancy's usually elegant handwriting was shaky, the words rushing together. "They won't let me see him. Keep saying he's stable, but what does that mean? Can't sleep. Can't think. What if she really loved him?" Sarah murmured. Yes, she did. Michelle set the note aside, which makes what we might find even more important. The hours ticked by. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the high windows. Sarah had stepped out to make some calls, leaving Michelle alone with the endless boxes. That's when she found it. At first, it seemed like just another folder, unmarked except for a date, September 15th, 1985. But the papers inside made her blood run cold. A memo, marked, "Eyes Only, Destroy After Reading," had somehow survived. And attached to it was a handwritten note from Ronald Reagan to Nancy, discussing their son Ron in terms that made Michelle's hands shake. "My dear," it began. "The surveillance reports came in. Our suspicions about Ron's proclivities appear to be correct. I've authorized continued FBI monitoring. We cannot allow this to become public. The boy needs to understand that certain behaviors are unacceptable in this family." Michelle sat back, her heart pounding. The formal, cold tone. The casual mention of using federal agencies to spy on his own child. The disgust barely hidden between the lines. "Oh my God," she whispered to the empty room. The door opened, making her jump. Sarah returned, carrying fresh coffee. "Mrs. Obama? Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Michelle looked at her young assistant, then back at the document in her hands. "Sarah, I need you to lock the door. What I'm about to show you, it changes everything we thought we knew about the Reagans." As Sarah read the memo, her eyes widening, Michelle stared out the window at the darkening sky. She thought about her own daughters, about unconditional love, about the masks people wear in public life. "What do we do with this?" Sarah finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michelle took a deep breath. "First, we make copies. Then we keep digging. Because if this survived, what else did they try to hide?" They worked late into the night, the silence broken only by the rustle of papers and the soft hum of Sarah's laptop. With each passing hour, Michelle felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. She had started this project looking for insight into a former First Lady's experience. Instead, she was uncovering a family's darkest secrets. Around midnight, Sarah finally packed up her things. "Same time tomorrow?" Michelle nodded, still staring at the memo. "Sarah, not a word about this to anyone. Not yet." After Sarah left, Michelle sat alone in the quiet room. She pulled out her phone, looking at a photo of her family, Barack playing, with their girls, all of them laughing. Her thumb hovered over the call button, wanting to share what she'd found with her husband. But something stopped her. This wasn't just about one family's pain anymore. This was about power, about the faces people show the world, about the lengths someone might go to protect an image. She carefully returned the documents to their folder, locked everything away, and gathered her things. As she walked through the silent archives, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Outside, the autumn wind had grown colder. Michelle pulled her coat tight again, watching her breath form clouds in the night air. Somewhere in the city, lights burned in other windows, other secrets waited in other boxes, and other families carried their own burdens. But for now, she had found something that would change everything. Not just about the Reagans, but about how America understood its own history. The question was, what would she find tomorrow? As her car pulled away from the curb, Michelle looked back at the imposing building. The weight of what she'd discovered pressed against her chest. She thought about Ron Reagan, somewhere out there, never knowing his father had him watched like a criminal. She thought about Nancy, carrying this secret among so many others, and she wondered, not for the first time, about the true cost of power, not in policies or politics, but in the human hearts it breaks along the way. The next morning would bring more discoveries, more shocks, more truths too heavy to carry alone. But that first revelation, that first glimpse behind the carefully maintained facade of America's perfect first family, would stay with her forever. In her apartment that night, Michelle couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the city, lights flicker, and began to write in her journal. Today I learned that history isn't just about what we choose to remember. It's about what others chose to hide. And sometimes, the most important truths aren't in the official records or the policy papers. They're in the quiet moments, the private fears, the secret hurts we never let the world see. She closed the journal, thinking about tomorrow, about the boxes still waiting to be opened, about the truth still waiting to be found. The real story was just beginning. The grandfather clock in her hallway struck midnight, its deep chimes echoing through the quiet apartment. Michelle finally headed to bed, but she knew sleep would be elusive. Her mind kept returning to that memo, to those cold words from father to mother about their own child. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed. But for tonight, she carried the weight of that first discovery, a reminder that behind every historical facade, there are real people, real pain, and real stories waiting to be told. As she drifted off to sleep, Michelle's last thought was of Nancy Reagan's voice during those phone calls years ago. Now, finally, she understood the sadness she'd heard. It was the sound of someone carrying too many secrets for too long. Morning came too quickly. Michelle woke to the sound of rain against her windows, her dreams filled with fragments of yesterday's discovery. Over coffee, she received a text from Sarah. Already at the archives. You need to see this. The urgency in those words made her hurry. Within 30 minutes, she was back in that dim room, where Sarah sat surrounded by even more open boxes. What did you find? Michelle asked, hanging up her rain-soaked coat. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she held up a thick file. I came in early to organize the next batch. This was hidden behind some budget reports. More about Ron? Michelle asked, taking the file. No, this is different. Look at the dates. All from 1985. It's about the AIDS crisis. Michelle opened the file and immediately felt her coffee threatening to come back up. The documents detailed a series of secret meetings between Reagan administration officials and pharmaceutical companies. Page after page revealed a calculated decision to delay research funding, complete with profit projections and political impact assessments. They knew, Sarah whispered. They knew how many people would die. Michelle found herself gripping the edge of the table. Get James in here. Now. When the head archivist arrived, he found Michelle pacing the room. Mrs. Obama, is everything all right? James, I need you to verify something for me. She pointed to the AIDS documents. Are these authentic? The signatures, the letterhead? He examined them carefully, pulling out a magnifying glass. After several tense minutes, he looked up. Yes, these are original documents. See these watermarks? And this particular paper stock was only used for executive branch communications during that specific year. My God, Michelle muttered, sinking into a chair. Sarah spoke up from her corner. Mrs. Obama, there's more. Look at page 17. It was a handwritten note from Reagan himself, dated months before any public acknowledgement of the crisis. Nancy, discussed with Pharma Group. Waiting provides better optics. Conservative base must be considered. We'll revisit in fall. This room fell silent except for the sound of rain against the windows. James quietly excused himself, leaving Michelle and Sarah alone with their discovery. You know what this means? Sarah finally said. Michelle nodded slowly. It means thousands of people died while they played politics. She stood up suddenly. I need air. Watch these documents. Don't let anyone in. In the bathroom, Michelle splashed cold water on her face. Looking in the mirror, she saw her mother's words from years ago. Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we have to tell. Returning to the research room, she found Sarah organizing the AIDS documents chronologically. Sarah, get the digital scanner ready. Every page gets copied. Every signature. Every note. Every margin scribble. What about the Reagan family stuff? From yesterday? Michelle paused. Keep those separate for now. This, she gestured to the AIDS documents. This is about public accountability. That was about private pain. We need to be careful about how we handle both. They worked through lunch, carefully documenting everything. Around 3 o'clock, a knock at the door made them both jump. Mrs. Obama? It was James again. There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent. Michelle opened the door to find an elderly man in a well-worn suit. I'm Richard Torres, he said quietly. I worked in the Reagan White House. Junior staff. I heard you were going through the files. Michelle studied him carefully. Come in, Mr. Torres. He entered slowly, his eyes taking in the documents spread across the table. I see you found them. The AIDS memos. You knew about these? He nodded, lowering himself into a chair. I was in some of those meetings. Junior staff, remember. Nobody noticed me taking notes. His hands shook slightly. My brother was dying of AIDS while they decided to wait. For better optics, Sarah brought him water while Michelle pulled up a chair. Mr. Torres, why are you here? Because there's more. Things that didn't make it into the files. Things I saw. Conversations I overheard. He pulled out an old notebook from his jacket. I kept everything. Been waiting for someone with the courage to tell the truth. For the next 2 hours, Torres shared his memories, filling in gaps in the documentary record. His voice broke when he described watching his brother die while knowing the administration was deliberately delaying action. As evening approached, Torres stood to leave. Mrs. Obama, be careful. Some people prefer these truths stay buried. After he left, Michelle and Sarah sat in stunned silence. Finally, Sarah spoke. What do we do now? Michelle looked at the growing pile of evidence. The family secrets, the political calculations, the human cost of power. Now we keep digging. Because this is just day 2, Sarah. And something tells me we've barely scratched the surface. She gathered her things, her mind already racing with the implications of everything they'd found. 2 days of research had already revealed more than she'd imagined possible. What else would they discover? As she left the archives that evening, the rain had stopped, but the air felt heavy with the weight of secrets finally coming to light. Michelle knew sleep wouldn't come easily tonight either. Not with the faces of AIDS victims in her mind. Not with Torres's brother's story echoing in her ears. Not with the knowledge that somewhere in those boxes, more truth waited to be found. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more pieces of a darker history than anyone had suspected. But for now, Michelle carried these first discoveries like stones in her pocket. Heavy, sharp-edged reminders that behind every political decision, real people lived and died, loved and lost, and sometimes kept secrets that could change history. 3 days had passed since Michelle's initial discoveries, each one bringing new revelations that kept her awake at night. But nothing could have prepared her for what she would find on that rainy Thursday morning. Mrs. Obama, you look exhausted, Sarah commented, setting down 2 large coffees on their now cluttered workspace. Did you sleep at all? Michelle shook her head, accepting the coffee gratefully. Kept thinking about Torres, about all those people who died while the administration debated optics. She sighed, looking at the mountain of boxes still waiting. What's on the agenda today? Sarah consulted her meticulously organized notebook. We're moving into late 1985. These boxes came from Nancy Reagan's private office. Her private office? Michelle straightened in her chair. Those would have been separate from the regular White House files. Exactly. And look at this. Sarah pulled out a document listing the contents. Most of it is typical First Lady stuff. Correspondence, schedules, charity work. But there's a note here about personal effects being included. They began methodically working through the box. The morning passed slowly, filled with mundane papers about state dinners and holiday decorations. Around noon, Michelle reached the bottom of another file and froze. "Sarah," she said quietly, "come here." Buried beneath years of official paperwork was a small red leather-bound book, its edges worn with use. Gold letters on the spine simply read, 1985. "Is that?" Sarah's eyes widened. "Nancy's personal diary." Michelle's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The first page was dated January 6, 1985, written in Nancy's distinctive flowing script. "Should we?" Sarah hesitated. "I mean, this is very personal." Michelle thought for a moment. "This isn't just about personal privacy anymore. We need to understand." The first few entries were fairly routine. Notes about White House events, comments about staff, minor irritations with scheduling. But as they read on, the tone began to change. March 15th, 1985. Something's wrong. Ronnie came back late again tonight, claiming he was in meetings. But when I asked about the trade policy discussion he supposedly had with Baker, he couldn't remember any details. This is the third time this month. Am I imagining things? Look at the handwriting, Sarah pointed out. It gets shakier here. They continued reading. The entries grew more frequent, more detailed, more desperate. April 3rd, 1985. Caught him in the study with her again. That young thing from the correspondence office. He says they're working on speeches, but I saw how quickly they jumped apart when I opened the door. He thinks I'm a fool. "Oh, God," Michelle whispered. She thought about all the photos she'd seen of the Reagans, the loving looks, the perfect presidential couple. The diary entries continued, painting a picture so different from the public image that it made her head spin. May 17, 1985. Third martini tonight. The staff knows not to disturb me after 8 p.m. now. Ronnie's with her again, of course. Working late. I hate him. God help me, but I hate him. And yet tomorrow I'll smile for the cameras, play my part. Because that's what we do. That's what America needs. Sarah sat back, looking pale. "Mrs. Obama, this completely changes everything we thought we knew about them." "Keep reading," Michelle said quietly. "There's more." June 2nd, 1985. The Secret Service confirmed it today. They've been meeting 3 times a week for months. She's 26, younger than our daughter. When I confronted him, he just stared at me with those blank eyes. Said I was being paranoid, but I know. I've always known. The entries grew darker, more painful to read. Nancy's elegant handwriting became erratic. Some pages stained with what looked like tears, or perhaps spilled drinks. July 15th, 1985. Called Nancy Reynolds tonight. Cried for hours. She says I should threaten to leave him, but we both know I can't. The presidency matters more than my pride. Sometimes I watch him sleeping and remember the man I married. Where did he go? When did we become these people who lie to each other? To ourselves? Michelle had to take a break, walking to the window to collect herself. The rain had started again, drops racing down the glass like tears. "Sarah," she said finally, "make copies of everything. But this diary, this needs special handling." "Of course." Sarah hesitated. "Mrs. Obama, there's something else you should see." She handed Michelle a small envelope that had fallen from between the diary's pages. Inside was a crumpled note, written on White House stationery. "My dearest R, meeting you has awakened something I thought was long dead. Nancy suspects, but she won't say anything. She can't. We both know she's trapped in this role as much as I am. Until tonight. R." The affair went on for months, Sarah said quietly, showing Michelle more diary entries. Nancy knew the whole time, but kept quiet to protect his image. Michelle sat heavily in her chair. All those public appearances, those loving interviews. She was dying inside. They spent the rest of the afternoon documenting everything, taking special care with the diary's fragile pages. As evening approached, Sarah noticed something. Mrs. Obama, look at these entries from late summer. They change. August 30th, 1985. Something's really wrong with Ronnie. It's not just the affair anymore. Today he couldn't remember cabinet members' names. Called Baker Johnson 3 times. When I mentioned it, he got angry, threw his glasses across the room. I'm scared. September 12th, 1985. Met with Dr. Morrison secretly today. He's worried too. Says we need more tests. But how can we do that without anyone knowing? The presidency comes first. It always comes first. God help me. What do I do? The affair wasn't the only secret she was keeping, Michelle said softly. She was watching him start to slip away. They worked late into the night, carefully documenting every entry. The diary painted a picture of a woman trapped in a gilded cage, dealing with a cheating husband, early signs of his mental decline, and the crushing weight of maintaining appearances. Around midnight, Sarah finally spoke up. Mrs. Obama? Can I ask you something personal? Michelle looked up from the diary. Of course. How did you and President Obama? I mean, was it ever this hard? Michelle smiled sadly. Every marriage has its challenges, Sarah. But this, she gestured to the diary. This is something else. This is about power and image and the price we ask people to pay for both. As they packed up for the night, Michelle carefully wrapped the diary in acid-free paper. Tomorrow we keep going. There's more here. I can feel it. In her car heading home, Michelle couldn't shake the image of Nancy Reagan sitting alone in her White House bedroom, writing these painful truths in her little red diary. The perfect political marriage. The loving couple that conservatives held up as an ideal. It had all been a carefully maintained facade. Her phone buzzed. A text from Barack. Coming home soon? Miss you. Michelle smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude for their honest, real relationship. She typed back. On my way. Love you. But as she drove through the rainy night, Nancy's words echoed in her mind. The presidency matters more than my pride. How many other political wives had made similar sacrifices? How many other perfect images were built on private pain? Tomorrow would bring more discoveries, more layers of the Reagan years to unpack. But tonight, Michelle carried the weight of Nancy's secret heartbreak, knowing that somehow these truths needed to be told. Back home, she found Barack waiting up for her. Rough day? He asked, noting her expression. You have no idea. She hesitated, then asked, do you remember how Nancy Reagan always looked at President Reagan during public appearances? Sure, like he hung the moon. They were famous for it. Michelle thought about the diary entries, the pain hidden behind those adoring gazes. Yeah, famous for it. She couldn't tell him what she'd found, not yet. But sitting there with her husband, she said a silent prayer of thanks for their real, honest love. No facades, no hidden diaries, no crushing secrets. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more pieces of the puzzle. But for tonight, Michelle sat with the knowledge that sometimes the most perfect-looking marriages hide the deepest pain. And that power extracts prices that no one sees until years later, when the truth finally emerges from a small red diary hidden in a box of history. The next morning dawned cold and clear. Michelle arrived at the archives early, her mind still swimming with Nancy's diary entries from the previous day. She found Sarah already there, surrounded by new boxes. You're not going to believe this, Sarah said without looking up. I found more correspondence between them. Letters they wrote when he was traveling. Michelle set down her coffee. From the same period? Yes, but these are different. Watch the dates carefully. Sarah laid out a series of letters. See how her tone changes? Early 1985, They're still loving. By summer, when the affair was happening, her letters get shorter, colder. May I? Michelle picked up one of the later letters. Dearest Ronnie, the doctor's appointment went well. Everything is fine, just as we discussed. Don't worry about the small lapses. Dr. Morrison says it's just stress. All my love, Nancy. She was covering for him, Michelle realized. Even in private letters. Sarah nodded. But look at this one from October. The letter was tear-stained. The paper crinkled. Ronnie, today you called me Betty 3 times. When I corrected you, you got angry. Said I was always nagging. Don't you remember? Betty was your first girlfriend, before the war. You haven't mentioned her in 40 years. I'm trying to protect you, but I'm scared. So scared. Nancy Michelle sat heavily in her chair. She was watching him slip away, dealing with the affair, and maintaining their public image all at once. Mrs. Obama? A soft knock at the door interrupted them. James, the head archivist, entered looking concerned. There's someone here who… Well, you should talk to her. A small, elderly woman entered. Her hands clutched a worn leather purse, and her eyes darted nervously around the room. This is Margaret Wilson, James said. She was Nancy Reagan's personal maid from 1984 to 1987. Michelle stood quickly. Mrs. Wilson, please, sit down. I heard you were going through the files, Margaret said softly. I've been carrying these for years. Maybe it's time. She opened her purse and pulled out a stack of photographs. Oh my God, Sarah whispered. The photos showed Nancy Reagan in private moments, crying at her dressing table, arguing with the president in the residence, sitting alone late at night with a glass in her hand. I shouldn't have taken them, Margaret said, her voice shaking. But someone needed to know. Someone needed to see what it was really like. Michelle spread the photos across the table. Why are you sharing these now? Because she deserved better. Margaret's voice strengthened. Everyone thought she was just this perfect political wife. But I saw her crying herself to sleep. I saw her checking his schedule, knowing where he was really going. I saw her practicing those loving looks in the mirror before public appearances. Sarah brought Margaret some water while Michelle examined the photos more closely. One showed Nancy writing in the red diary they'd found, her face streaked with tears. The worst part, Margaret continued, was watching her cover for him when the confusion started. She'd whisper names to him before meetings, remind him of basic things. She was terrified someone would notice. Did anyone else know? Michelle asked. A few of us staff. The Secret Service probably. But who were we to say anything? She was protecting him. Protecting the presidency. They spent hours with Margaret, recording her memories, matching her stories to entries in the diary. As the sun began to set, she stood to leave. There's one more thing, Margaret said, reaching into her purse. She gave me this letter, told me to keep it safe. Said maybe someday someone would need to know the truth. The envelope was sealed, with the First Lady's personal seal. Inside, Nancy's elegant handwriting filled 3 pages. To whoever finds this, history will remember us as the perfect political couple. The newspapers call it a great love story. And it was. Once. But love stories aren't always what they seem. I write this not for revenge or bitterness, but for truth. Ronnie is slipping away, day by day. The doctors say it's early, but I see it in his eyes. The young woman he turned to. Perhaps he was trying to grasp at youth, at memories, at something slipping away. I stay because I must. Because the presidency is bigger than my hurt, than his betrayal, than our crumbling private world. I stay because someone has to remember which senator is which policy was discussed, which decision was made. I stay because I love him, even now. Even as he forgets me, mistakes me for someone from his past, rages at shadows in his mind. History will judge us, but know this, behind every perfect political image, There's a human story, and sometimes the greatest act of love is protecting someone who has hurt you, preserving their dignity when they can no longer preserve it themselves. Nancy Reagan. December 1985. Michelle folded the letter carefully, her hands shaking slightly. Mrs. Wilson, thank you. This changes everything. After Margaret left, Michelle and Sarah sat in silence, surrounded by the evidence of a marriage both stronger and more broken than anyone had known. What do we do with all this? Sarah finally asked. Michelle looked at the photos, the diary, the letter. We tell the truth, not to destroy their legacy, but to show the real strength behind it. Nancy Reagan wasn't just a devoted wife. She was the backbone of a presidency, carrying burdens no one ever knew. As they packed up for the day, Michelle thought about how history is written, how public images are crafted, how private pain is hidden away in boxes and diaries and sealed letters. Tomorrow would bring more discoveries, more layers to unpack. But tonight, she understood something profound about power, about love, about the price some people pay to maintain the illusions we all need to believe in. In her car, Michelle found herself crying. For Nancy, for all the political wives who smiled through their pain, for the complicated truth behind every simple narrative. The streetlights blurred through her tears as she drove home, thinking about Nancy Reagan practicing those adoring looks in the mirror, protecting her husband even as he slipped away from her, maintaining a facade that history had accepted as truth until now. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, but tonight, Michelle sat with the weight of these discoveries, understanding that sometimes the greatest stories are the ones written in private, in tears, in small red diaries hidden away from the world's eyes. The rain had finally stopped, but a heavy fog blanketed Washington as Michelle made her way to the archives. A week had passed since the discoveries about Nancy Reagan's private struggles, and each day seemed to bring new revelations that challenged everything she thought she knew about those years. Morning, Sarah called out, already at their usual table. The new boxes came up from storage. These are different. Michelle hung up her coat. Different how? They're from the National Security Council files. Everything's coded, classified. I've never seen so many security stamps. Michelle picked up one of the folders. Red, top secret stamps crossed every page, along with strings of numbers and letters that made no sense. Have you started sorting them? Yes, but... Sarah hesitated. I think we need help with these. Look at this. She handed Michelle a yellowed document covered in what looked like random characters. Michelle studied it. Some kind of code? Has to be. And look at the date. March 1983. 2 years before Gorbachev. Before Michelle could respond, there was a knock at the door. James entered with an elderly man in a crisp navy suit. Mrs. Obama, this is Dr. Alan Peterson. He was a cryptographer for the NSA during the Reagan years. Dr. Peterson smiled warmly. When James told me what you'd found, I had to come. Those codes, I helped design them. For the next hour, Dr. Peterson explained the various encryption systems used during the Cold War. His fingers traced the mysterious characters with familiar ease. This one, he said, pointing to a particularly dense page. This was our most secure channel, used only for the most sensitive communications with Moscow. With Moscow? Michelle leaned forward. In 1983? But relations were terrible then. Reagan had just announced the Strategic Defense Initiative. That's what the public thought. Dr. Peterson pulled out a small notebook. Let me show you how to read these. As he taught them the decryption methods, a pattern began to emerge. What looked like random characters transformed into clear messages. Secret communications between Washington and Moscow that painted a very different picture of the Cold War's final years. Sarah gasped as she decoded one message. Mrs. Obama, look at this. It's from April 1983. Urgent from Moscow. Initial response positive. Andropov willing to discuss preliminary framework. Requires absolute secrecy. Traditional channels compromised by hardliners on both sides. Keep going, Michelle urged. They spent hours decoding message after message. A secret history emerged, one of quiet diplomacy and careful negotiations years before the public thaw in relations. I need air, Michelle said finally, standing up. This changes everything we thought we knew about how the Cold War ended. In the hallway, she found James waiting. There's more, he said quietly. We found another box. These aren't just diplomatic cables. There are personal messages too. The new box contained hundreds more coded messages, but these were different. Many were handwritten, showing a more intimate side of the secret negotiations. One decoded note particularly stood out. To our friends in Moscow, the public rhetoric must remain harsh. My speeches will continue to condemn the Soviet system. But know that behind these words, we are building a bridge. History requires patience. He was playing a double game, Sarah whispered. All those tough speeches, while secretly paving the way for peace. Michelle finished. But why keep it hidden for so long? Dr. Peterson cleared his throat. Because the truth would have been too dangerous then. Both sides had hardliners who would have sabotaged everything if they'd known. They worked through lunch, then dinner, decoding message after message. Around midnight, Sarah found something that made her drop her pen. Oh my God, she breathed. Mrs. Obama. It was all planned. All of it. The message was dated months before Reagan's famous Berlin Wall speech. Confidential. Moscow eyes only. Wall speech scheduled for June. Rhetoric will be strong. Tear down this wall. But signals commitment to negotiated solution. Your people should be ready with positive public response. Choreography crucial for next phase. Confirm receipt and coordination. Michelle sat back, stunned. The most famous moment of the Cold War's end was staged. Not staged. Dr. Peterson corrected. Choreographed. Both sides knew they needed a dramatic public moment to shift perceptions, but it had to look spontaneous. Sarah was already digging through more files. Here's the Soviet response. Washington eyes only. Timing and language approved. Our media will respond with measured optimism. Strategic leaks suggesting internal debate will follow. Public opinion preparation proceeding as discussed. Coordination confirmed. The whole thing was a dance, Michelle murmured. Every step carefully planned. They worked late into the night, piecing together more of the secret history. The carefully maintained public antagonism, the behind-the-scenes negotiations, the gradual preparation of both populations for peace. It was all documented in these coded messages. Around 2 a.m., Sarah found one more crucial document. Unlike the others, this one was in plain English. A memo from Reagan to his closest advisors. The public can never know how long we've been talking to Moscow. They need to believe in the power of dramatic moments, of strong speeches, of good triumphing over evil. The truth, that peace comes through patience, through quiet compromise, through letting both sides save face. This truth must wait for history. When these files are opened decades from now, perhaps we'll be ready to understand that endings aren't always what they seem, and that the greatest victories are often won in silence, far from the cameras and microphones. R.R. Michelle read the memo 3 times. He knew, she said softly. He knew these files would be found someday. He was writing to us, to history. Dr. Peterson nodded. The question is, what do you do with this knowledge now? It was a question that kept Michelle awake that night. The next morning, she arrived early at the archives, determined to understand more. Look at this timeline I made, Sarah said, pointing. To her laptop, the secret negotiations started even before Reagan's evil empire speech. Every public confrontation was balanced by private outreach. It's brilliant, really, Michelle mused. They maintained the public narrative both sides needed while quietly building the path to peace. Mrs. Obama? James appeared at the door. There's a call for you. Someone who says he was part of the Moscow negotiations. The voice on the phone was heavily accented, elderly but clear. I hear you have found our old messages. Yes, Michelle said carefully. You were involved? I was translator for Soviet side. Many late nights, coding and decoding. Many secrets. He paused. You understand now, yes? Why it had to be this way? I think so, Michelle replied. Both sides needed to appear strong while actually compromising. Exactly. World was not ready for truth then. Perhaps now, after the call, Michelle sat quietly, absorbing everything they'd learned. Sarah worked on organizing their findings, occasionally sharing new details she discovered. It's like a Russian nesting doll, Sarah said. Each layer we open reveals another secret underneath. And we're not done yet, Michelle replied, reaching for another box of coded messages. Something tells me there's more to find. As the day wore on, they uncovered more layers of the secret negotiations. Careful plans for economic cooperation, cultural exchanges, even preliminary discussions about German reunification, all hidden behind a public facade of continued Cold War tension. Around sunset, Dr. Peterson made one final discovery. Look at this, he said, holding up a decoded message from late 1983. Most urgent. Moscow to Washington. Your proposal accepted in principle, but must maintain appearance of resistance for minimum 2 years. Suggest escalating public tensions, while quietly building framework for transition. Multiple stages required. Trust essential. They knew, Michelle said softly. They knew years before it happened how it would end. They just had to wait for the world to be ready. As they packed up for the day, Sarah asked the question they'd all been thinking. How do we tell this story? How do we explain that everything people think they know about the end of the Cold War is not wrong? Michelle interrupted. Just incomplete. The public story mattered too. It gave people hope, gave them something to believe in. But now, maybe it's time for the full truth. Outside, the fog had lifted, revealing a clear night sky. Michelle stood on the archive steps, thinking about how history is written and rewritten, about public stories and private truths, about the complex dance between appearance and reality in world-changing events. Tomorrow would bring more discoveries, more layers to unpack. But tonight, she understood something profound about how peace is really made. Not in grand public moments, but in quiet rooms where former enemies learn to trust each other. One coded message at a time. The next morning brought another layer to their discoveries. Michelle arrived to find Sarah staring at her computer screen, her face pale. What is it? Michelle asked, setting down her coffee. I spent all night cross-referencing the decoded messages with public events. Look at this pattern. Sarah turned her laptop around. Every time Reagan made a tough anti-Soviet speech, there was a secret message sent to Moscow within hours. Michelle leaned in to read. Post-speech urgent. Washington to Moscow. Public rhetoric necessary for domestic audience. Disregard heightened. Language. Negotiations proceed as planned. Your cooperation in maintaining appearance of tension appreciated. They had it down to a science. Sarah marveled. The harsher the public words, the more reassuring the private messages. Michelle finished. She sat down heavily. Have you found anything else about the Berlin Wall speech? Actually, yes. Sarah pulled out a thick folder. These are all the preparation documents. You won't believe how detailed the choreography was. They spent the morning going through the papers. Every aspect had been carefully planned. The crowd placement, the camera angles, even the exact wording had been negotiated through back channels. A knock interrupted their work. Dr. Peterson entered with an elderly woman. Mrs. Obama, this is Elena Volkova. She was a junior diplomat at the Soviet embassy during the Reagan years. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she sat down. I helped encode many of these messages when I heard you had found them. She paused, collecting herself. There are things you need to understand about those times. For the next 3 hours, Elena shared insider details about the secret negotiations. She described late-night meetings, in anonymous hotel rooms, coded phone calls, and the delicate balance of managing hardliners on both sides. The hardest part, Elena said, was keeping it from our own people. Both sides had those who wanted the Cold War to continue. They were comfortable with the enemy they knew. How did you maintain the secrecy? Michelle asked. Elena smiled sadly. We created what you Americans call plausible deniability. Every public action that looked like conflict was actually carrying a different message for those who knew how to read it. She pulled out an old notebook from her purse. I kept my own records. Against regulations, of course, but history needs its witnesses. The notebook contained Elena's personal observations of the secret negotiations. One entry particularly caught Michelle's attention. June 12, 1987. Today R will give the Berlin speech. M says everything is prepared. Our press will react with proper outrage, but also plant seeds of internal debate. The dance continues. Sometimes I wonder if future generations will understand why we had to play these games. But how else could we have ended it without someone losing face? The speech, Michelle said slowly. Everyone thinks it was this spontaneous, powerful moment that helped end the Cold War. It was powerful, Elena corrected, but not because it was spontaneous. It was powerful because both sides had carefully crafted it to serve multiple audiences. For the public, it was a bold challenge. For those of us who knew, it was a signal that the endgame was beginning. Sarah had been quiet, taking notes. Now she spoke up. Mrs. Volkova, why are you telling us this now? Elena looked out the window for a long moment. Because it's time. The world needs to understand that peace doesn't come from grand gestures or tough talk. It comes from patient people willing to work in secret, to swallow their pride, to build trust step by step. As Elena prepared to leave, she handed Michelle one last document. This was never officially recorded. It was too personal. It was a handwritten note from Reagan to the Soviet leadership, dated the day before the Berlin Wall speech. Tomorrow I will speak words that history will remember. The world will see them as a challenge, but you will know them as a promise. When I say, tear down this wall, I am not threatening. I am acknowledging what we have already agreed must happen. The wall will fall not by force, but by mutual consent, when the time is right. Together, we have written two scripts, one for the world to see, and one that only we will know. Both are true in their way. Both serve their purpose. Let history judge us not by our public words, but by the peace we built in secret. R. Michelle carefully folded the note. Thank you, Mrs. Volkova. This changes everything. After Elena left, Michelle and Sarah sat in silence, surrounded by the evidence of a diplomatic masterpiece that had been hidden for decades. What do we do with all this? Sarah finally asked. Michelle looked at the stacks of decoded messages, the preparation documents, Elena's notebook, the private note. We tell the truth, not to diminish what happened, but to show how peace is really made. Sometimes the greatest victories are the ones no one knew about until years later. As they packed up for the day, Michelle thought about how history is written and rewritten, about public narratives and private truths, about the complex dance between appearance and reality in world-changing events. Tomorrow would bring more discoveries, more layers to unpack, but tonight, she understood something profound about how the world really works, not through the grand gestures everyone sees, but through the patient, careful work that happens in the shadows, one coded message at a time. Michelle sat in her Chicago office, surrounded by copies of the documents they'd discovered over the past weeks. The morning sun cast long shadows across her desk, where photographs, diary entries, and decoded messages told a story that would rewrite history. Her phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. Just landed in Chicago. Big news. Coming straight there. 20 minutes later, Sarah burst into the office, still carrying her travel bag. Mrs. Obama, you're not going to believe who contacted the archives after we left yesterday. Michelle looked up from Nancy's diary photographs. Who? George Schultz. The Paul name hung in the air. Reagan's Secretary of State, now in his late 90s, was one of the few surviving members of that administration. What did he want? He wouldn't say exactly, but he's flying to Chicago. Today. Sarah checked her phone. His office said he needs to speak with you personally about our discoveries. Michelle felt her heart race. When? That's the thing. Sarah hesitated. He's already here. In the building. As if on cue, Michelle's assistant knocked on the door. Mrs. Obama? Secretary Schultz is here to see you. He entered slowly, leaning on a cane, but his eyes were sharp and alert. Despite his advanced age, George Shultz carried himself with the same diplomatic presence that had helped guide American foreign policy through the Cold War's final years. Mrs. Obama, he said warmly, accepting her offered chair. I hear you've been doing some interesting reading. Michelle gestured for Sarah to close the door. Mr. Secretary, this is unexpected. Please, call me George. He smiled, looking at the documents spread across her desk. I see you found Nancy's diary, and the Moscow telegrams, and… His voice softened. The truth about Ron. You knew? Michelle leaned forward. About all of it? My dear, I didn't just know. I helped plan it. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a worn leather folder. These are my personal notes from those years. I've been waiting for someone to find the other documents before sharing these. Sarah quickly set up her laptop to record as Schultz began to speak. You have to understand something crucial, he said, his voice strong despite his age. Nothing you found was there by accident. Every document, every diary entry, every coded message, we preserved them deliberately, with specific instructions about when they could be released. Michelle felt her mouth go dry. You're saying… I'm saying that history needs its secrets, Mrs. Obama. But it also needs its revelations, when the time is right. He opened his folder. Nancy knew her diary would be found eventually. She wanted it found. The same with the Moscow telegrams, the surveillance files about Ron. Everything. But why? Sarah asked. Why not just tell the truth at the time? Schultz smiled sadly. Because America needed its myths, the world needed to believe in the simple version. The great communicator who stood up to the evil empire. The perfect first lady who always looked at him with adoration. The family values president who brought mourning back to America. And the reality, Michelle prompted. The reality was messier. A man struggling with early dementia while trying to end the Cold War. A wife covering for him while dealing with his infidelity. A father who couldn't accept his son's sexuality. And behind it all, a carefully choreographed dance with the Soviets to end the Cold War without either side losing face. He pulled out more papers from his folder. We knew someday the truth would need to come out. But timing is everything in history, just as it is in diplomacy. Michelle picked up one of his notes. It was dated 1989, just before the Reagans left office. Final meeting RE. Document preservation. Nancy agrees all personal papers to be sealed until appropriate time. Vital that future generations understand full complexity of these years. But must wait until world is ready for nuanced view of power, personality, and necessity of maintaining useful illusions. GS. You've been waiting for this moment, Michelle said slowly. All of you. Those of us who are left. Yes. Schultz looked out the window. We've watched America become more polarized, more convinced that everything is either completely good or completely evil. We thought, perhaps, the time had come for a more complex truth. Sarah spoke up. But sir, this will change everything people believe about those years. Exactly, my dear. Schultz smiled. Sometimes people need their illusions shattered to see a deeper truth. They spent hours going through his notes, matching them with their discoveries. Around noon, Michelle's assistant brought lunch, which grew cold as they worked. There's one more thing, Schultz said finally, pulling out a sealed envelope. Nancy gave me this before she died. Said I'd know when it was time to share it. Inside was a letter, written in Nancy's distinctive hand. To whoever finds our truth, by now you've read my diary. You've seen the telegrams. You know about Ron, about Ronnie's decline, about the careful dance we did with the Soviets. You might wonder why we created such elaborate illusions. The answer is simple. Because people needed them. They needed to believe in morning in America, in a president who never doubted or faltered, in a marriage that never wavered, in good triumphing over evil. But they also need, eventually, to understand that real strength lies in our humanity, not our myths. Real leadership means sometimes hiding your doubts while you work toward peace. Real love means protecting someone even when they've hurt you. I chose which documents to preserve, which truths to save for future generations, because someday, America will need to understand that its heroes were human, that peace comes through compromise, not confrontation, that power extracts personal costs few ever see. Use these truths wisely. They belong to history now. Nancy Reagan Michelle read the letter twice before looking up. What do you think we should do with all this? Schultz leaned back in his chair. That, Mrs. Obama, is up to you. But if you want my advice, the world needs this truth, not to tear down reputations, but to understand how change really happens, how peace is really made, how power really works. Sarah had been quiet, taking notes. Now she spoke up. We should write a comprehensive report, work with historians, journalists, tell the full story with proper context. Michelle nodded slowly. Not to destroy the legacy, but to deepen it. Schultz finished. To show that real greatness lies not in perfection, but in how we handle our imperfections. As the afternoon light faded, they began making plans. Michelle would lead the project, working with a carefully chosen team of historians and journalists. Sarah would organize the documents, creating a detailed timeline of both public events and private truths. One last thing, Schultz said as he prepared to leave. Nancy believed, and I agree, that these revelations might help heal some of our current divisions. When people understand that even their heroes were human, perhaps they'll be more accepting of human frailty in their leaders today. After he left, Michelle and Sarah sat in silence for a long moment. It's a huge responsibility. Sarah finally said, Yes, Michelle agreed. But maybe that's why we found all this. Maybe the time really has come for a more nuanced understanding of power, of leadership, of human nature itself. She looked at the stacks of documents, Nancy's diary, the Moscow telegrams, the surveillance files about Ron, Schultz's notes, and Nancy's final letter. Together, they told a story not just about one presidency or one family, but about the complex relationship between truth, power, and the stories we tell ourselves about our leaders. Tomorrow, they would begin the real work, crafting a narrative that would reshape America's understanding of a crucial period in its history. But tonight, Michelle sat with the weight of these truths, knowing that sometimes the greatest service we can do for history is to reveal its full, complex, human heart. As night fell over Chicago, Michelle remained in her office, unable to leave the weight of history behind. Sarah had gone to arrange hotel accommodations for an extended stay, leaving Michelle alone with the documents and her thoughts. Her phone rang. It was Barack. Mish, you okay? You've been quiet these past weeks. She stared at Nancy's final letter. I found something, Barack. Something big. How big are we talking? Big enough to change how we see an entire era of American history. She paused. I need your advice, but I can't tell you everything. Not yet. She could hear him smile through the phone. Sounds familiar. Sometimes the hardest choices are the ones we have to make alone. After hanging up, Michelle opened her laptop and began to write. Preliminary Report Outline 1. The Public Image versus Private Reality 2. Nancy Reagan, Power Behind the Throne 3. The Moscow Back Channel 4. Family Secrets and Surveillance 5. The Choreography of Peace 6. The Cost of Power. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. CNN called. They're hearing rumors about our research. What should I tell them? Michelle thought carefully before responding. Nothing yet. We do this right, or not at all. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant entered with an elderly woman Michelle had never seen before. "I'm sorry to come so late," the woman said softly. "I'm Margaret Thatcher's former aide. I heard about your discoveries, and there's something you should know about the Reagan years from our side." For the next hour, the aide shared stories that corroborated and expanded their understanding. She described late-night calls between Nancy and Margaret, conversations about managing powerful men who were slowly losing their grip. "The women knew," she said simply. "They all knew, and they protected their husbands, their countries, the peace process itself." After she left, Michelle sat in the growing darkness, thinking about the weight these women had carried. Her phone buzzed again. More messages from reporters getting wind of the story. Sarah returned, looking exhausted but excited. "Mrs. Obama, I've been thinking, what if we approach this as a series? Start with the personal stories, Nancy's diary, the family dynamics, then move to the political revelations. Give people time to absorb each layer." Michelle nodded slowly. "We need to be careful with the timing. The personal revelations about Ron, the affair, we need to handle those with particular sensitivity." Speaking of sensitivity, Sarah hesitated. "Patty Davis called while you were meeting with the Thatcher aide. She wants to talk." Michelle checked her watch. Almost midnight. "Set up a call for tomorrow. We need her perspective, but we also need to be respectful of her feelings about all this." They worked late into the night, organizing documents, planning the report structure, discussing how to handle the inevitable media storm. Around 2 a.m., Sarah found something they'd missed. "Mrs. Obama, look at this note in the margin of George Shultz's files." The handwritten comment read, "Nancy's choice to preserve evidence of Ronnie's affair. Bravest decision of all. Shows real character isn't about perfection, but about facing truth." She could have destroyed it all, Michelle mused. Every record, every photo, every painful memory. Instead, she deliberately preserved them for history. But why? Sarah wondered. Why keep evidence of such personal pain? Because Michelle paused, thinking of her own years in the White House. Because sometimes the most important historical truths are the human ones. The ones that remind us our leaders aren't marble statues or cartoon villains. They're flawed, complex human beings, trying to do their best in impossible situations. Dawn was breaking when they finally prepared to leave. Michelle looked at her preliminary report outline, now covered in notes and revisions. "Sarah, what do you think Nancy would want us to do with all this?" Sarah thought for a moment. I think she'd want us to tell the truth. Not to tear down legacies, but to show that real legacies are built on real human stories, not polished myths." Michelle nodded, gathering her things. "Tomorrow we start assembling our team. Historians, journalists, fact-checkers. We do this right." As they left the office, the first rays of sun were painting the Chicago skyline gold. Michelle thought about Nancy Reagan, about all the mornings she must have watched the sun rise over Washington, carrying her secrets, protecting her husband, playing her part in the great dance of power and peace. "You know what's strange?" Michelle said as they waited for the elevator. "In trying to protect their legacy by hiding the truth, they actually created a more powerful legacy by making sure the truth would eventually come out. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more decisions, more responsibility. But tonight, Michelle Obama carried the weight of history with a clear purpose. To tell a story not of perfect heroes or simple villains, but of real people who changed the world while wrestling with their own very human struggles.